Today, we're diving into the epic saga of Athens, a city that rose from humble beginnings to become the intellectual powerhouse of the ancient world, survived catastrophic defeats, and continues to influence our lives today in ways you never imagined. Picture this. It's 3,400 years ago, and you're standing on a rocky hill in what would become Greece. Around you, Bronze Age warriors are building the first settlements that will eventually become one of history's most influential cities. But Athens wasn't always the shining beacon of civilization we remember. Its story is filled with tyrants and heroes, brilliant minds and devastating wars, golden ages and dark periods that would make any Hollywood blockbuster seem tame by comparison. The earliest inhabitants of Athens weren't even Greek. They were mysterious people we call the Pelasgians, who built their lives around the sacred rock we now know as the Acropolis. Legend tells us that the city got its name from a contest between two gods, Athena and Poseidon, competing to become its patron deity. Athena offered the olive tree, symbolizing peace and prosperity, while Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, creating a spring of salt water. The people chose Athena's gift, and thus Athens was born under the protection of the goddess of wisdom. But let's move beyond mythology to the real foundation of Athenian power. Around 1600 BCE, Mycenaean Greeks arrived and established a fortified palace on the Acropolis. These weren't the philosophers and democrats we associate with Athens, but warrior kings who controlled trade routes and commanded respect through military might. For centuries, Athens remained relatively small compared to other Greek centers like Mycenae and Pylos. The collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BCE plunged Greece into what historians call the Dark Ages. But Athens survived better than most cities. While other centers were abandoned or destroyed, Athens maintained continuity, preserving cultural traditions that would later bloom into classical Greek civilization. This survival wasn't luck. It was strategic positioning and adaptability that would become hallmarks of Athenian success. As Greece emerged from the Dark Ages around 800 BCE, Athens began its transformation from a minor settlement into a major power. The key was trade. Athenian merchants ventured across the Mediterranean, establishing connections with cities from Sicily to the Black Sea. But more importantly, they began importing ideas along with goods. Egyptian mathematics, Phoenician writing systems, and Near Eastern artistic techniques all flowed into Athens, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that fostered innovation. The real turning point came in the 7th century BCE, when social tensions reached a breaking point. The gap between rich landowners and poor farmers had grown so wide that civil war seemed inevitable. Into this crisis stepped Solon, a poet and politician who would become Athens' first great reformer. Around 594 BCE, Solon introduced revolutionary changes that laid the groundwork for democracy. He canceled debts, freed those who had been enslaved for debt, and most importantly, created a new constitution that gave political rights based on wealth rather than birth. Solon's reforms were radical for their time, but they didn't solve all of Athens' problems. Political instability continued until another remarkable figure emerged, Peisistratos. Now, Peisistratos was technically a tyrant, but he was the kind of tyrant who understood that true power comes from popular support. He seized control around 560 BCE and spent the next several decades transforming Athens into a cultural and economic powerhouse. Under Peisistratos and his sons, Athens experienced its first golden age. The tyrant invested heavily in public works, building temples, fountains, and roads that made the city a marvel to behold. He established the Panathenaic Games to rival the Olympics and commissioned the first written copies of Homer's epic poems. Most importantly, he welcomed artists, craftsmen, and intellectuals from across the Greek world, making Athens a magnet for talent and innovation. But tyranny, even benevolent tyranny, couldn't last forever. In 510 BCE, the last of the Peisistratid tyrants was overthrown, and Athens stood at another crossroads. The aristocrats wanted to return to oligarchy, but the people had tasted political participation and weren't willing to give it up. Enter Cleisthenes, the man who would earn the title Father of Democracy. Cleisthenes' reforms around 508 BCE were nothing short of revolutionary. He reorganized Athenian society, breaking up the old tribal system that had kept power in the hands of a few families. Instead, he created new political units called deimes, essentially local neighborhoods that gave every citizen a voice in government. He established the assembly, where all citizens could debate and vote on issues affecting the city. And perhaps most ingeniously, he created the practice of ostracism, allowing citizens to vote once a year to exile a politician who was becoming too powerful. This wasn't democracy as we know it today. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from citizenship. But for its time, Athenian democracy was unprecedented in human history. For the first time, a significant portion of a city's population had a direct say in how they were governed. The implications were staggering, not just for Athens, but for the entire concept of political organization. The new democracy faced its first major test almost immediately. In 499 BCE, Greek cities in Asia Minor rebelled against Persian rule and asked for help. Athens sent 20 ships to support the rebellion, a decision that would have enormous consequences. When the Persians crushed the revolt, they didn't forget Athens' involvement. King Darius swore revenge against the city that had dared to challenge the mighty Persian Empire. The Persian Wars that followed would define Athens' place in history. In 490 BCE, a Persian army landed at Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens. The odds seemed hopeless. The Persians outnumbered the Greeks by at least 2-1. But the Athenians, fighting for their homes and their newfound freedom, achieved one of the most famous victories in military history. The Battle of Marathon proved that the Persian Empire could be defeated and established Athens as the leading defender of Greek independence. 10 years later, the Persians returned with an even larger force under Xerxes, determined to conquer all of Greece. This time, Athens faced a terrible choice: flee their city or fight to the death. The Athenian leader Themistocles made a bold decision. He convinced his fellow citizens to abandon Athens and put their faith in their navy. The city was evacuated, and the Persians burned it to the ground. But Themistocles had a plan. He lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, where their numerical advantage meant nothing. In one of history's most decisive naval battles, the Greek fleet, led by Athens, destroyed the Persian navy. Xerxes watched his dreams of conquest sink beneath the waves and retreated to Asia, leaving only a land force that was defeated the following year at Plataea. The Persian Wars transformed Athens from a regional power into the leader of the Greek world. Cities across the Aegean Sea looked to Athens for protection against future Persian attacks. In 478 BCE, Athens organized the Delian League, an alliance of Greek cities that was supposed to be a partnership among equals. In reality, it quickly became an Athenian empire, with member cities paying tribute to fund the Athenian navy. The wealth flowing into Athens from the Delian League funded the most remarkable period in human history, the Golden Age of Athens under Pericles. From about 460 to 430 BCE, Athens became a beacon of human achievement that has never been matched. This was when democracy reached its fullest expression, when philosophy and science flowered, when art and architecture achieved perfection, and when theater was invented as an art form. Pericles himself was a master politician who understood how to balance the demands of democracy with the need for effective leadership. He was elected general 15 consecutive times, giving him the continuity needed to implement long-term projects. Under his guidance, Athens rebuilt itself more magnificently than ever before. The Parthenon, still one of the world's most recognizable buildings, was constructed during this period, along with the other temples that make the Acropolis a wonder of ancient architecture. But the Golden Age was about much more than buildings. This was when Socrates began asking the questions that would lay the foundation of Western philosophy. Sophocles and Euripides were writing tragedies that explored the deepest questions of human existence. Herodotus was inventing the discipline of history, while Hippocrates was establishing medicine as a science rather than superstition. The achievements of Golden Age Athens in just a few decades surpass what most civilizations accomplish in centuries. Yet even at its height, Athens contained the seeds of its own downfall. The wealth and power that funded the Golden Age came from an empire that other Greek cities increasingly resented. Sparta, Athens' greatest rival, watched the growth of Athenian power with growing alarm. The two cities represented completely different ways of life. Athens was democratic, commercial, and cosmopolitan, while Sparta was militaristic, conservative, and isolationist. The tension finally exploded in 431 BCE with the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would last 27 years and ultimately destroy the Greek world as it had existed. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battles with the superior Spartan army while using Athens' naval supremacy to wear down the enemy. For a while, it seemed to work, but then disaster struck in an unexpected form. In 430 BCE, a plague swept through Athens, killing perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles himself. The disease, possibly typhus or smallpox, devastated the crowded city and shattered morale. With their greatest leader dead and their population decimated, the Athenians became increasingly desperate and reckless in their conduct of the war. The war dragged on with victories and defeats on both sides, but gradually Athens' position weakened. The turning point came in 415 BCE, when Athens launched the disastrous Sicilian expedition, an attempt to conquer Syracuse and expand their empire westward. The expedition was a catastrophic failure that cost Athens most of its navy and thousands of its best citizens. Sparta seized the opportunity to bring the war to Athens' doorstep. In 404 BCE, after a siege that reduced the proud city to starvation, Athens finally surrendered. The democracy was dissolved, the walls were torn down, and the empire was lost. For a brief period, Athens was ruled by the 30 tyrants, a pro-Spartan oligarchy that terrorized the city. It seemed like the end of everything Athens had represented, but reports of Athens' death were greatly exaggerated. In 403 BCE, democratic exiles returned and restored the old constitution. The city began the slow process of rebuilding, and while it never again achieved its former military dominance, it remained the intellectual center of the Greek world. This was when Plato established his academy and Aristotle founded the Lyceum, making Athens the university of the ancient world. The 4th century BCE saw Athens adapt to a new reality. Instead of military conquest, the city focused on commerce, culture, and diplomacy. Athenian merchants continued to dominate Mediterranean trade, while Athenian schools attracted students from across the known world. The city learned to survive by being useful rather than dominant, a lesson that served it well in the changing political landscape of Greece. That landscape changed dramatically with the rise of Macedonia under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great. In 338 BCE, Philip defeated a coalition of Greek cities, including Athens, at the Battle of Chaeronea, ending Greek independence. But Philip was smart enough to recognize Athens' special status, allowing the city to maintain its democratic institutions and cultural prominence. Under Alexander and his successors, Athens found a new role as the cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. While political power shifted to the great kingdoms of Macedonia, Egypt, and Syria, Athens remained the place where ambitious young men came to study philosophy, rhetoric, and science. The city's reputation for wisdom and learning made it influential far beyond its military capabilities. The Romans, when they conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, showed Athens particular respect. They recognized the city as the source of much that they admired in Greek culture and allowed it considerable autonomy. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to study in Athens, and the city became a kind of university town of the ancient world. During the Roman period, Athens experienced several revivals. The Emperor Hadrian, who visited in the 2nd century CE, funded extensive building projects and tried to restore the city to something approaching its former glory. New philosophical schools flourished, and Athens remained a center of learning even as Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire. The rise of Christianity posed new challenges for Athens. The city that had been the birthplace of rational philosophy suddenly found itself confronted by a religion that emphasized faith over reason. The famous confrontation between St. Paul and Athenian philosophers at the Areopagus, described in the Acts of the Apostles, symbolized this cultural clash. Yet Athens adapted once again, becoming an important center of Christian learning, while somehow maintaining its philosophical traditions. The Byzantine period saw Athens decline in importance as Constantinople became the empire's new intellectual center. The great philosophical schools were finally closed in 529 CE by Emperor Justinian, ending a tradition that had lasted over 1,000 years. For several centuries, Athens became little more than a provincial town, its ancient glory seemingly forgotten. The city's fortunes revived somewhat during the Middle Ages, as it became an important center of silk production and trade. The Parthenon was converted into a Christian church, and later, during the Ottoman period, into a mosque. Various foreign powers controlled the city: Byzantines, Franks, Catalans, Venetians, and finally Ottomans, each leaving their mark on its development. The Ottoman period, lasting from 1456 to 1833, was generally one of decline for Athens. The city shrank to a small town of perhaps 10,000 inhabitants, and many of its ancient monuments suffered damage or neglect. The Parthenon itself was severely damaged in 1687, when Venetian artillery ignited an Ottoman ammunition dump stored inside the building. Yet even during these dark centuries, Athens never completely lost its symbolic importance. European travelers during the Renaissance and Enlightenment made pilgrimages to see the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. The city's ancient heritage inspired the intellectual movements that would eventually lead to the modern world's embrace of democratic values and scientific thinking. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, marked the beginning of Athens' modern revival. Although the initial fighting was concentrated elsewhere, Athens became a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom. The idea that the birthplace of democracy should be free from foreign rule resonated strongly with European public opinion and helped secure international support for Greek independence. In 1834, shortly after Greek independence was secured, Athens was chosen as the capital of the new Greek state. This decision was largely symbolic, as other cities like Nafplio were more important at the time, but the symbolic power of Athens was undeniable, and the new government set about creating a capital worthy of the nation's ancient heritage. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw Athens transform from a sleepy Ottoman town into a modern European capital. New buildings were constructed in neoclassical style to evoke the city's ancient glory, while archaeological excavations revealed more of its buried past. The first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens in 1896, deliberately connecting the new international movement with its ancient Greek origins. The 20th century brought new challenges and opportunities for Athens. The city grew rapidly as Greece's population increased, and rural inhabitants moved to urban areas. World War II brought occupation and suffering, but also demonstrated the enduring spirit of Athenian resistance. The post-war period saw explosive growth as Athens became the dominant city in Greece, eventually home to over a third of the country's population. Yet, even during these dark centuries, Athens never completely lost its symbolic importance. European travelers during the Renaissance and Enlightenment made pilgrimages to see the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. The city's ancient heritage inspired the intellectual movements that would eventually lead to the modern world's embrace of democratic values and scientific thinking. Today's Athens is a bustling metropolis of nearly 4 million people, a far cry from the ancient city-state that once dominated the Aegean. Yet, the ancient legacy remains powerfully present. The Acropolis still dominates the cityscape, reminding residents and visitors alike of Athens' extraordinary past. The principles of democracy, philosophy, and rational inquiry that originated here continue to shape our world. Modern Athens faces many of the same challenges that confronted the ancient city: how to balance democracy with effective governance, how to maintain prosperity in a competitive world, how to preserve cultural identity while adapting to change. The economic crisis that struck Greece in 2010 tested Athenian resilience just as the Persian Wars once did. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Athens is not its past achievements, but its continuing relevance. The questions that Socrates asked in the Agora are still being debated today. The democratic ideals that Cleisthenes pioneered continue to evolve and spread. The scientific method that began with Athenian philosophers remains our best tool for understanding the world. From its mythical founding to its role as a modern European capital, Athens has been at the center of human civilization for over 3 millennia. It has survived conquest and occupation, plague and war, rise and decline, always managing to reinvent itself while maintaining its essential character. No other city can claim such a continuous and influential role in shaping human thought and society. The story of Athens reminds us that civilizations are not built by armies or wealth alone. but by ideas and institutions that can inspire people across centuries and continents. Democracy, philosophy, theater, history, science. These gifts from ancient Athens continue to enrich human life and will do so as long as people value freedom, truth, and beauty. Yet even during these dark centuries, Athens never completely lost its symbolic importance. European travelers during the Renaissance and Enlightenment made pilgrimages to see the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. The city's ancient heritage inspired the intellectual movements that would eventually lead to the modern world's embrace of democratic values and scientific thinking.